Continue with God's story, with the story of Jesus and Peter walking on the water and the feeding of the 5,000 or 10,000. From the book of Matthew, the 14th chapter, verses 13 through 33. Now, when Jesus had heard about the beheading of John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, and he cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." But the disciples replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side while Jesus dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, and the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the lake. But when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Right now, 805 million people in this world do not have enough to eat. Poor nutrition causes about half of the deaths in this world in children under the age of 5. That's 3.1 million kids under the age of 5 dying of hunger. If women farmers had the same access to resources as men, the number of hungry in the world would be reduced by about 150 million people. The world produces enough food to feed all 7 billion people, but those who go hungry either do not have land to grow food or money to purchase it. Poverty is the principal cause of hunger. Experts calculate that about $3.2 million in U.S. dollars is needed to reach all 66 million hungry school-aged children. That's about what we spend in the U.S. every year on ice cream. The direct medical cost of hunger and malnutrition is estimated at $30 million every year. It would cost $3 billion to end it, and it costs $30 billion to treat it. An estimated 7.6 million children, almost 20,000 a day, will die of hunger. Every 4.3 seconds, another child dies of malnutrition. Although hunger exists in developing countries, hunger is also a prevalent problem in the United States. I just returned from spending almost a week in Detroit, Michigan. And Detroit has some alarming statistics concerning poverty and hunger. Since 1950, Detroit's population has plunged 63%. The unemployment rate hit a high of 27.8% in July of 2009. Detroit has the highest violent crime rate of any large U.S. city, almost 5 times higher than any other. 40% of the streetlights don't work. 78,000 buildings are abandoned, including 137 empty schools. Today, nearly half of Detroit's 138 square mile area is vacant. Of Detroit's remaining population, 1 in 5 people face hunger every day. 1 in 2 children. That's about half the children in Detroit are hungry. The reality is, we live in a hungry world. 49, 50, 51, 52. Today's gospel talks about the issue of hunger. And of course, the crowds have followed Jesus, and they want to be cured. They want to be healed. And there they are late in the day, and the disciples say, we need to do something. Send them away so that they can get their own food. And Jesus says, no. Let them come to me. Now there's 3 things that I want to point out about today's text. The first one is the story of Jesus feeds the 5,000. And of course, this is the title that we normally use for this passage, is Jesus feeds 5,000. But like Pastor Siri pointed out, there's a few things that aren't completely accurate. First of all, it's not just Jesus that feeds them, it's the disciples. What a wonderful model of ministry. That Jesus gives to the disciples, and the disciples give to the people. What a wonderful model of discipleship. And not a crowd of 5,000, but closer to 10,000 people. Now, the thing I love about this story is that initially the disciples say, we don't have enough. Let them fend for themselves. Let them go to the villages and buy their own food. All we have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's barely enough for us, let alone 10,000 people. But when Jesus starts to provide, is there enough? Not only is there enough, but there's more than enough. And I think this story exemplifies the abundance of God's blessing. Not only in food, but the abundance of God's love. Not only is there enough, but there's more than enough. The second thing I want to point out about this text is Peter walking on water. Now, I think it's interesting that they're all in the boat and they see Jesus. They don't recognize Jesus. Jesus speaks to them, and Peter says, if it's really you, call me to come to you. And Jesus does. He says, come. And Peter steps out of the boat. Now, often we refer to this text as Jesus walks on the water or Peter walks on the water, but I think a better description of this would be Peter walks on the water for a while. Because he starts to doubt and he starts to sink. And Jesus grabs him by the hand and brings him back to safety. And Jesus says, "You of little faith." But yet with just a little bit of faith, what does Peter do? He does a miracle. He walks on water. Even if for only a little while, it's still a miracle. By a little bit of faith. Jesus says, "You of little faith." But what about everybody else in the boat? They stay where it's safe. They stay where it's comfortable. It's Peter that has enough faith to step out of the boat. And no doubt it took a lot of faith. It took a lot of courage. Well, I like this little story. You've maybe heard it before. It's a cheesy preacher story. I don't think it's even true, but I actually like the point of the story. A crowd had gathered at Niagara Falls to watch this tightrope walker walk the tightrope across Niagara Falls. And so he's got his long balance beam, and he's going to walk it, and he says to the crowd, "Do you think I can do it?" And the crowd cheers, and they say, "You can do it, you can do it, go for it." And so the tightrope walker starts to walk. And he walks across the falls. He turns around, and he comes back. And the crowd cheers, and the tightrope walker puts down the balance beam, and he picks up 2 rocks, and he says, "Do you think I can walk across with 2 rocks?" And everybody said, "You can do it, you can do it, go for it." And so he starts to walk the tightrope with these 2 rocks, and he walks across to the other side, and he turns around, and he comes back, and the crowd cheers. And so then the tightrope walker says, and he grabs a wheelbarrow, he loads it up with rocks. He says, "Do you think I can do it with a wheelbarrow full of rocks?" And everybody said, "You can do it, you can do it, go for it." And so he takes the wheelbarrow, and he walks across the tightrope, across Niagara Falls, turns around, and comes back. And the crowd cheers. And so the tightrope walker takes all of the rocks out of the wheelbarrow and says, "Now who wants to get into the wheelbarrow?" And of course, the crowd was silent. There's a difference between standing on the sideline and saying, "You can do it," and actually taking the leap of faith and getting involved. For Peter to step out of that boat took courage. It took bravery. It took faith. Are we going to stand on the sidelines, or are we going to get into the wheelbarrow? Peter takes the leap of faith, steps out of the boat, and puts his faith into action. The third thing that I want to point out about this text is about recognizing God for being God. Jesus is walking on the water. The disciples are in the boat, and they don't recognize that it's Jesus. They don't recognize God for being God. And they're in fear, and they say, "Who is it? Is it a ghost?" When what they're looking at is God. I think this speaks to a reality in our own lives. That God can be at work all around us, and we don't even recognize that it's God. I've got another cheesy pastor story, and I don't think this one's true either. And when I told this one over at the nursing home, I told it all wrong, but I still like the point of this one too. A man gets swept away by floodwaters, and he prays to God to save him. And the waters bring him past a roof, and a man is standing on the roof of his house, and he says, "Take hold, I'll save you." And the man says, "No, God is going to save you." Well, the waters continue to rush, and a boat comes up to him, and they reach out their hand, and they say, "Take hold, we'll save you." And the man that's caught in the flood says, "No, I've prayed to God, and God is going to save me." Well, the waters continue to rush, and a helicopter comes and drops a ladder and says, "Take hold, we'll save you." And the man says, "No, God is going to save me." And he drowns. Well, he goes to heaven, and he says to God, "Why didn't you save me? I prayed for help, and you didn't save me." And God says, "What are you talking about? I sent a man on a roof, a boat, and a helicopter." I know it's a cheesy story, but I like the idea of how God works in our lives, and oftentimes we don't even recognize it. God works in mysterious ways, including through ordinary people like you and me. And sometimes we're the man in the flood, and sometimes we're on the roof, sometimes we're in the boat, sometimes we're in the helicopter. God is at work in our lives, but sometimes we don't recognize God for being God. 98, 99, 100, 101. God is at work in our lives, and God is at work in this congregation. Specifically around issues of hunger-related problems, God continues to work through this congregation. Last year, our Saviors contributed over $9,000 to Central African Republic, the majority of that for Springbox Wells to bring clean drinking water to villages. We raised over $3,000 for World Food Summit. We contributed hundreds of pounds in financial support to our local food pantry and over $10,000 to local special offerings. In all, we gave away over $70,000 to world and local missions. God is at work right here in this community, but sometimes we don't see it. Pastor Siri serves on the Eastern North Dakota Synod Hunger and Justice Committee. I chair the Eastern North Dakota Synod Stewardship Team, both with a focus on serving the needs of the communities and the world. We have numerous members of this congregation who serve in a variety of capacities, including local food pantry, world missions, and local missions. God is at work in this congregation, and God is at work in Detroit. Although some of these alarming statistics are true about Detroit, there is also hope. Since the unemployment rate hit a high of 27.8% in 2009, the unemployment rate has dropped to 16%. Still high, but moving in the right direction. The unemployment rate is improving, the crime rate is improving, the car industry is booming, and because of the efforts of ordinary people, life is getting better in Detroit. This summer, we'll be sending 30 of our senior high students and 10 adults to the ELCA National Youth Gathering held in Detroit. We'll join 35,000 other Lutherans for worship, fellowship, fun, mission, and ministry. And several people have asked, why Detroit? That doesn't seem like a very fun city. It's a dangerous and poor city. But that's exactly the reason why we need to go there. Now, I had a few of these concerns myself of safety and the poverty-stricken area of Detroit. And when I was in Detroit, I spoke to the bishop of Detroit and I said, I have concerns. My parents are worried about sending their kids to a place like Detroit. And he said, not only can your parents send their kids to Detroit, we have to go to Detroit. And I think he's right. And the fact that it's poverty-stricken is exactly why we have to go there. To send 35,000 people with a message of hope and to boost their economy with hotel rooms and convention centers and meals and retail sales really will be a boost to Detroit. And Detroit is a fun city with a rich history and good people who are working hard to improve their situation. Now, sending 30 youth to Detroit doesn't fix the problem, but it does make a difference. Today we have a chuck it in the bucket placed in the back of the church. You're welcome to place your change or any contributions that you'd like to make to poverty in Detroit. This will go to support our youth who are going to the ELCA National Youth Gathering, to help our youth in Detroit, and to make a difference. The work that we have been doing is making a difference. In 1970, 1 out of 4 people lived in extreme poverty. Now that number is 1 in 9. Our efforts are making a difference. Not just relief, but development. We are educating girls, giving medicine, building schools, giving loans and animals for families to be self-sufficient. You see, we are all faced with the same dilemma as the disciples. Do we stay in the boat where we are reasonably safe and comfortable, or do we take a leap of faith? It's easy to stand on the sidelines and say, you can do it, go for it. But it takes faith to get into the wilderness, to get involved, to make a difference, to go out and feed a hungry world. And it's about much more than just food. It's about faith. Today we'll be receiving the gift of the sacrament of Holy Communion. We'll receive the bread and the wine. And what's so special about the bread and the wine? Well, it's not the bread and the wine, it's the bread and wine together with the Word of God. When we bring food, we bring a meal, and that's important. But when we bring food together with the Word of God, we bring hope. We do live in a hungry world, but there is hope. The hope that comes in Jesus Christ through you and me. 148, 149, 150. Since the time that I started this sermon, over 150 kids have died of hunger. Let's step out of the boat, let's get into the wheelbarrow, let's get involved, and let's put our faith into action. To God be the glory, now and forever.